My name is Liam Hartwell, and this is the story of how a bouquet of white lilies changed everything I thought I knew about family, love, and the courage it takes to honor the dead. The morning of Grandmother Eleanor's funeral dawned gray and humid, the kind of Charleston spring day that wraps around you like a damp blanket. Our grand colonial mansion, with its towering columns and ivy-covered walls, had been filled with the quiet bustle of preparation since sunrise. Darla Simmons, our longtime housekeeper, moved through the rooms like a ghost, straightening flowers and polishing surfaces that were already immaculate. I stood in my bedroom, adjusting my black tie for the third time, staring at my reflection in the antique mirror that had belonged to Eleanor's mother. At 18, I looked more like my grandmother than either of my parents. The same gentle brown eyes, the same thoughtful expression that seemed to carry the weight of unspoken words. Eleanor used to say I had an old soul, that I saw things others missed. Looking back, I wish I had seen more. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The white lilies sat on my dresser, freshly cut from Eleanor's garden that morning. They were her favorite flowers, the ones we'd planted together when I was 12 and she'd first moved in with us after grandfather's death. She'd taught me that lilies symbolized rebirth, renewal, the promise that beauty could emerge from darkness. I'd chosen them as my final gift to her, my way of saying goodbye to the only person in our house who had ever made me feel truly seen. Downstairs, I could hear my mother Claudia's voice carrying through the marble foyer, sharp and commanding as she directed the catering staff. Even in grief, she orchestrated everything with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. My father, Judge Victor Hartwell, would be in his study, reviewing his eulogy with the same methodical attention he gave to his legal briefs. Everything had to be perfect. In the Hartwell family, appearances were everything. The funeral service at St. Michael's Episcopal Church was a masterpiece of Southern elegance. Charleston's elite filled the pews, their whispered condolences and practiced expressions of sympathy creating a low hum beneath the organ music. Eleanor would have hated the spectacle. She'd always preferred quiet conversations over grand gestures, garden dirt under her fingernails over perfectly manicured hands. When it came time for the final viewing, I approached the casket with trembling hands. Eleanor looked peaceful, dressed in the lavender dress she'd worn to my graduation. I placed the white lilies gently beside her folded hands, whispering the words I'd never been brave enough to say when she was alive. Thank you for loving me when no one else seemed to notice I existed. That's when it happened. My mother stepped forward, her face a mask of composed grief for the watching crowd. Without a word, without even a glance in my direction, she lifted the lilies from the casket and walked to the nearby trash receptacle. The sound of them hitting the bottom of the bin echoed through the suddenly silent church like a gunshot. I stood frozen, watching the woman who had given me life discard my final tribute to the woman who had given me love. Around us, the congregation shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether they had witnessed a moment of grief-induced confusion or something far more deliberate and cruel. In that moment, staring at my mother's perfectly composed face, I began to understand that Eleanor's death had revealed something that had been hidden beneath our family's polished surface for years. The question was, did I have the courage to look? The reception at our estate felt like a performance where everyone knew their lines except me. Charleston's finest mingled in our parlor, their voices creating a gentle murmur beneath the crystal chandelier that had hung there since before the Civil War. Mother moved through the crowd like a gracious hostess, accepting condolences with the perfect balance of dignity and sorrow. To anyone watching, she was the devoted daughter grieving her beloved mother. But I couldn't stop seeing those white lilies disappearing into the trash. Martin Doyle, our family attorney, had been watching me from across the room with the kind of careful attention that made my skin prickle. He was a tall, distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an owlish appearance. He'd handled our family's legal affairs for as long as I could remember, and Eleanor had always spoken of him with unusual warmth. As the last of the guests departed, Martin approached my parents and me in the parlor. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows across the Persian rug, and suddenly the vast room felt smaller, more intimate, charged with an electricity I couldn't name. "Victor, Claudia," Martin said, his voice carrying a formality that seemed heavier than usual. "There's a matter we need to discuss. Eleanor left specific instructions." Mother's perfectly composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something sharp and calculating beneath. "Of course. I assume we're discussing the estate transfer?" "Eleanor and I went over everything months ago." Martin's expression remained neutral, but I caught something in his eyes, a flicker of what might have been regret or perhaps resolve. He withdrew a sealed envelope from his briefcase, the paper cream-colored and thick, with Eleanor's distinctive handwriting across the front. "Actually, Claudia, there have been some changes. Eleanor revised her will 6 months ago and left this letter with specific instructions that it be read immediately following the funeral." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Father shifted uncomfortably in his leather armchair, his judge's instincts clearly sensing the gravity of the moment. Mother's hands, which had been gracefully folded in her lap, tightened into fists. "Changes," she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. Martin carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. Eleanor wanted me to read this aloud, in the presence of the immediate family. He cleared his throat and began, "My dearest family, if you are hearing this letter, then I am at peace, and it is time for truth to take the place that lies have occupied for too long. Claudia, my daughter, I have watched you build a life of beautiful surfaces while your heart grew cold. You have confused control with love, image with worth, and I will not allow you to pass these poisonous lessons to my grandson." Mother's face had gone white, but Martin continued steadily. "Liam, my precious boy, I am leaving the estate, the foundation I have quietly established, and the responsibility for our family's true legacy to you. Not because you are perfect, but because you still remember how to love without conditions, how to see beauty in simple things, how to choose kindness when cruelty would be easier." The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, I realized that Eleanor's death hadn't just taken away the one person who truly loved me. It had handed me a weapon I wasn't sure I was brave enough to wield. I escaped to Eleanor's garden as soon as Martin finished reading the legal documents that accompanied the letter. The formal language of trusts and foundations had washed over me like a foreign language, but the implications were clear enough. Everything had changed, and I was drowning in the deep end of a pool I'd never meant to enter. The garden was Eleanor's masterpiece, though she'd never called it that. Tucked behind the main house, it sprawled across nearly an acre of carefully tended beds, where roses climbed ancient trellises and jasmine perfumed the evening air. She'd spent countless hours here, teaching me the names of flowers and the patience required to coax beauty from soil. "Gardens don't lie," she'd once told me, her weathered hands gentle on a struggling seedling. "They show you exactly what you put into them." Now the garden felt abandoned, overgrown in the weeks since Eleanor's illness had kept her bedridden. Weeds pushed through the mulch, and the roses needed pruning. It broke my heart to see her sanctuary neglected, but it also felt appropriate somehow, as if the garden was mourning too. She knew this day would come. I turned to find Darla Simmons standing at the garden gate, her usually pristine uniform wrinkled from the long day. She'd worked for our family for nearly 20 years, arriving shortly after Eleanor moved in. Unlike the parade of staff my mother employed for special occasions, Darla had always been more than hired help. She was Eleanor's confidant, her companion during the long afternoons when the rest of us were too busy with our important lives to notice an elderly woman sitting alone. "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already knew. Darla stepped into the garden, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path. "Your grandmother wasn't a fool, Liam. She saw how your mother treated her, how she was planning to change everything once Eleanor was gone. This estate, this garden, the charitable work Eleanor did quietly. Your mother would have swept it all away to make room for her own vision." I sank onto the stone bench where Eleanor and I used to sit together, feeling the weight of inheritance pressing down on my shoulders like a physical thing. She left me everything because she didn't trust her own daughter. Quote, She left you everything because she trusted you, Darla corrected gently. There's a difference. A memory surfaced, Eleanor and me planting bulbs the previous fall, her hands guiding mine as we buried the promise of spring flowers in the dark earth. Patience, Liam, she'd said. The most beautiful things take time to grow, and they need to be tended with love, not force. Darla, I said slowly, what else did she tell you? About her plans, I mean. The older woman's expression grew thoughtful. She kept a journal. Hidden in her bedroom, she said if anything happened to her, I should make sure you found it. She paused, glancing back toward the house, where I could see my parents through the parlor windows, their body language tense with conflict. She said you'd need to understand the whole truth, not just the parts your mother wanted you to see. As the sun set behind the Charleston skyline, painting the garden in shades of gold and amber, I realized Eleanor had left me more than an inheritance. She'd left me a choice. Remain the passive observer I'd always been, or become the guardian of values I was only beginning to understand. The question was whether I had the courage to open that journal and learn what other secrets my family had buried beneath its perfect facade. That night, after my parents had retreated to their separate corners of the house to nurse their wounds and plan their strategies, I slipped into Eleanor's bedroom. The room still smelled like her lavender sachets and the rosewater she'd dabbed behind her ears each morning. Moonlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the hardwood floors where I'd sat as a child, listening to her stories about Charleston before the tourists and development changed everything. Her mahogany wardrobe stood against the far wall, its carved doors hiding decades of memories. Darla had said the journal was hidden, and Eleanor had always been clever about tucking away the things that mattered most. I ran my hands along the interior walls of the wardrobe, feeling for any irregularities, until my fingers found a small panel that shifted under pressure. The journal was bound in soft leather, worn smooth by years of handling. Eleanor's careful script filled page after page, dating back nearly 5 years. As I read by lamplight, her voice seemed to whisper from the pages, revealing a side of our family's story I'd never known existed. March 15th. Claudia accused me today of filling Liam's head with unrealistic expectations about kindness. She says I'm making him weak. I told her that compassion is not weakness, but she looked at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. How did I raise a daughter who confuses cruelty with strength? June 3rd. Liam helped me plant the new rose bushes today. He asked why I spend so much time in the garden when I could hire someone to do the work. I tried to explain that some things lose their meaning when we hand them off to others. He's beginning to understand, I think. There's hope in that boy, hope that Claudia has tried so hard to extinguish. September 22nd. I've made my decision about the Lucille Foundation. Named it from my mother, who taught me that education is the one gift that can never be taken away. Claudia would be furious if she knew I've been funneling money into literacy programs for underprivileged children. She'd call it, quote, throwing good money after bad causes. But what's the point of having wealth if we don't use it to lift others up? The entries painted a picture of secret generosity, of Eleanor quietly funding after-school programs, adult literacy classes, and scholarship funds, while my mother hosted charity galas that raised money for organizations she'd never actually visited. Eleanor had been building something real while Claudia built her reputation. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before Eleanor's death. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I can feel my time growing short, and I'm not afraid. But I am worried about Liam. Claudia will try to mold him into her image of success, all surface polish and strategic relationships. She doesn't understand that true legacy isn't about preserving wealth or status. It's about preserving values. I've done what I can to protect him, to give him choices she would never offer. The foundation is ready, the trust is established, and Martin knows my wishes. Now it's up to Liam to decide what kind of man he wants to become. Taped to the final page was a small brass key and an address for First Charleston Bank. Below it, Eleanor had written in her careful script, for when you're ready to see the whole picture, my dear boy." Quote. Sitting in her quiet room, surrounded by the remnants of a life lived with intention and grace, I understood that Eleanor hadn't just left me an inheritance. She'd left me a roadmap for becoming the person she believed I could be. The question now was whether I had the courage to follow it, knowing it would lead me directly into conflict with the woman who had given me life but never really tried to understand it. The next morning, I called Darla and asked her to meet me at First Charleston Bank. I'd barely slept. Eleanor's journal pages burned into my memory like photographs. Every entry had revealed another layer of the woman I thought I'd known completely, and each discovery made me realize how little I'd understood about the quiet war being waged within our own home. The bank sat in Charleston's historic district, its neoclassical columns and brass fixtures radiating the kind of old money authority that made my palms sweat. Darla met me at the entrance, her usual calm demeanor tinged with nervous energy. "Are you sure about this?" she asked as we approached the customer service desk. Before I could answer, the bank's glass doors opened behind us, and my mother's voice cut through the marble-floored lobby like a blade. "Liam, what exactly do you think you're doing?" I turned to find Claudia striding toward us, her heels clicking against the floor with military precision. She was dressed in a charcoal business suit that made her look like she was preparing for battle, which, I was beginning to realize, she probably was. "I'm following Grandmother's instructions," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "Those instructions," she hissed, lowering her voice as other customers turned to stare, "are the ravings of a sick old woman who clearly wasn't thinking straight in her final months. I won't let you humiliate this family by chasing after some fantasy Eleanor concocted." That's when Martin Doyle appeared, seemingly from nowhere, carrying his ever-present briefcase and wearing the expression of a man who had anticipated this exact scenario. "Claudia," he said with professional courtesy that couldn't quite mask his disapproval, "Eleanor was of completely sound mind when she established this arrangement. I have the medical documentation to prove it if necessary." The bank officer, a middle-aged woman who clearly recognized the Hartwell name, approached our growing group with cautious professionalism. "Is there something I can help you with?" Quote. Martin stepped forward, presenting official documents with Eleanor's signature and seal. "We're here to access Safety Deposit Box 247, registered under the Eleanor Hartwell Educational Trust." As the officer examined the paperwork, Claudia's composure began to crack. "This is ridiculous, Martin. Eleanor never mentioned any educational trust to me. I was her daughter, her primary heir." "You were her daughter," Martin agreed quietly, "but you were never her confidant." The words hung in the air like a sentence passed down from a judge's bench. Claudia's face flushed crimson, but the bank officer had finished her review and was nodding to Martin. "Everything appears to be in order. Mr. Hartwell, if you'll follow me." In the secure vault area, surrounded by rows of gleaming metal boxes, I used Eleanor's key to open box 247. Inside, I found a thick manila envelope containing legal documents that confirmed the Lucille Foundation's existence and funding. Nearly $2 million quietly transferred over 5 years. But it was the personal letter addressed to me that made my hands tremble. "My dearest Liam," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have chosen courage over comfort, truth over convenience. The foundation is real, the money is yours to steward, and the responsibility is enormous. But I have watched you your entire life, and I know you have the heart for this work. Don't let anyone, not even my own daughter, convince you that kindness is weakness, or that love is a luxury we can't afford." Beneath the letter lay another envelope, sealed and labeled in Eleanor's careful script, "For Claudia, when she's ready to remember what love looks like." Standing in that vault, surrounded by the concrete proof of my grandmother's faith in me, I realized that Eleanor hadn't just given me an inheritance. She'd given me the tools to become the man she'd always believed I could be, even if it meant standing up to the woman who had raised me to be silent. 2 days after the bank vault revelation, I found myself running laps around the empty track at Charleston Prep at nearly midnight. My mother had spent the entire day on the phone with her own attorney, her voice echoing through the mansion's halls as she demanded legal options to challenge what she called an obvious manipulation of a vulnerable elderly woman. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had spent years undermining Eleanor's dignity was now claiming to protect it. Liam? Quote, I turned to find Priya Patel jogging toward me, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. My best friend since middle school, Priya had always been the one person who could see through my family's polished facade to the lonely kid underneath. Couldn't sleep either? She asked, falling into step beside me. Haven't really slept since the funeral, I admitted. Everything's falling apart, Priya. Or maybe it was already broken, and I'm just now seeing the cracks. We slowed to a walk, and I found myself telling her everything. The flowers in the trash, Eleanor's letter, the foundation, the journal entries that revealed years of quiet cruelty I'd witnessed but never fully acknowledged. So your grandmother left you $2 million to help kids get educated, and your mother is furious about it? Priya's voice carried that edge of sarcasm she reserved for situations that defied logic. It's not about the money, I said, though even as I spoke the words, I wondered if that was entirely true. It's about control. Mom built her whole identity around managing our family's image, our legacy. Eleanor bypassed her completely. Priya stopped walking and grabbed my arm, forcing me to look at her. Liam, listen to yourself. You're talking about honoring your grandmother's wishes like it's some kind of betrayal. She trusted you with something beautiful, something that could actually help people, and you're feeling guilty about it? In the distance, Charleston's church bells chimed midnight, and I realized Priya was right. For years, I'd been so focused on keeping peace in our house that I'd forgotten there might be something worth fighting for. What if I'm not strong enough? I asked. What if I can't handle the responsibility? Then you'll learn, she said simply. But what if you don't try? What if you let your mother bury this foundation the same way she tried to bury those flowers? Standing there on the empty track, surrounded by the kind of silence that only comes in the small hours of morning, I began to understand that Eleanor hadn't just left me money and responsibility. She'd left me a choice between becoming the person my mother wanted me to be and becoming the person I actually was. The question was whether I had the courage to disappoint the living in order to honor the dead. Sarah Chen, from the Charleston Observer, had known Eleanor through the literacy program at the Downtown Community Center, one of the many quietly funded projects my grandmother had supported for years. When Darla suggested I speak with her about the foundation, I felt Eleanor's presence guiding me toward the light. Your grandmother was remarkable, Sarah said as we sat in the cafe across from the newspaper office. She never wanted recognition, just results. When I heard about the foundation being formalized, I knew her story needed to be told. The article appeared 3 days later under the headline, Local Philanthropist's Hidden Legacy Lives On Through Grandson's Mission. Sarah had captured something I hadn't even realized I was feeling, the weight of carrying forward someone's values when they could no longer speak for themselves. By noon, my phone was buzzing with messages from community members who remembered Eleanor's quiet kindness. A teacher from the East Side Literacy Program wrote about supplies that mysteriously appeared when budgets fell short. A single mother shared how Eleanor's scholarship fund had made college possible for her daughter. But the response that mattered most came from my mother. I found her waiting in the parlor when I returned from school, the newspaper spread across the mahogany coffee table like evidence in a trial. Her face was pale with fury, her hands trembling as she held the article. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice barely controlled. "How dare you air our family's private business to the entire city?" "It's not private business, Mother. It's grandmother's legacy." Eleanor's legacy, she spat, was supposed to be managed quietly, through proper channels, not splashed across newspapers like some common charity case. She stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked Eleanor's garden. "I've spent years building this family's reputation, and you've undone it all with one reckless interview." That's when Darla appeared in the doorway, her expression calm but her eyes flashing with something I'd never seen before, anger. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said quietly, "your mother tried to have Eleanor declared mentally incompetent last year. Did you know that? She hired doctors, consulted lawyers, all because Eleanor wouldn't stop, wasting money on other people's children. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's face went ashen, but Darla continued. Eleanor passed every evaluation. Her mind was sharp until the very end. She knew exactly what she was doing when she chose Liam over you. In that moment, watching my mother's carefully constructed world crack open like an eggshell, I realized that Eleanor's true gift wasn't the money or the foundation. It was the courage to choose love over control, even when love was more difficult and far less predictable. The question was whether I had inherited that courage, or just the consequences of it. The confrontation came on a humid Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the article appeared. I found my mother waiting for me in Eleanor's garden, her designer dress incongruous against the backdrop of climbing roses and overgrown jasmine. She stood rigid among the flowers Eleanor had loved, as if the very ground beneath her feet was hostile territory. "We need to talk," she said without preamble, her voice carrying the kind of cold authority I remembered from childhood scoldings that felt more like trials. I sat on Eleanor's favorite stone bench, the one where she'd taught me to identify birds by their songs and flowers by their scents. Even now, 3 weeks after her death, I could almost feel her presence in this place, as if her love had taken root alongside the plants she'd tended. "This nonsense ends now, Liam," Claudia's words cut through the evening air like a blade. "This public campaign of yours, this foundation, it's tearing apart everything I've worked to build for this family." "Maybe it needed to be torn apart," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Her face flushed crimson. "Don't you dare speak to me with that tone. I am your mother. I have sacrificed everything to give you the life you have, the opportunities, the status. And this is how you repay me? By publicly humiliating me with your grandmother's delusions?" "They weren't delusions, Mother. The foundation is real. The children Eleanor helped are real. The program she funded, our bleeding heart sentimentality that will bankrupt this family within a generation." She stepped closer, her perfectly manicured hands clenched into fists. "Your father's position, our place in Charleston society, the connections I've spent decades cultivating, you're destroying it all for what? Some fantasy about helping strangers?" The venom in her voice when she said, "helping strangers," revealed everything I needed to know about the woman who had raised me. "Here's what's going to happen," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. "You're going to call that reporter and tell her you were mistaken, that you misunderstood Eleanor's wishes. You're going to dissolve this foundation and transfer the assets to the proper family trust, and you're going to do it publicly, with an apology for any confusion you've caused." "And if I don't?" The smile that crossed her face was cold enough to freeze blood. "Then you'll discover what it means to truly be orphaned, Liam. No family, no support, no inheritance beyond Eleanor's misguided charity project. I'll cut you off completely, financially, socially, emotionally. You'll be dead to me." I stood, slowly, feeling Eleanor's strength flowing through me like sap through the roots of her beloved garden. For the first time in my life, I looked my mother directly in the eyes and saw her clearly, not as the powerful figure who had shaped my childhood fears, but as a woman so terrified of losing control that she was willing to destroy her own son to maintain it. "Then I guess I'm already dead to you," I said quietly, "because I won't betray the only person who ever truly loved me to please the one who never did." I walked away from her then, leaving her standing alone among Eleanor's flowers, and I didn't look back. 6 months later, the Hartwell mansion had been transformed into something Eleanor never could have imagined, but would have absolutely loved. The grand parlor, where Charleston's elite once sipped champagne and whispered gossip, now hosted adult literacy classes. The formal dining room had become a homework help center, where neighborhood children bent over math problems with volunteer tutors. The library, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, welcomed anyone seeking knowledge, or simply a quiet place to read. My father had surprised everyone, including himself, by supporting the conversion. "Your grandmother was right about many things," he'd told me quietly one evening as we watched children playing in what had once been our pristine front lawn. I should have listened to her more, and to your mother less. Claudia had left Charleston 2 weeks after our confrontation in the garden, taking an apartment in Atlanta, where she could rebuild her social circle among people who didn't know about her ungrateful son and his ridiculous charity work. She'd tried one last manipulation, sending my father with divorce papers that demanded half the estate's value. Martin Doyle had smiled when he showed me the documents. Eleanor's trust had been constructed to prevent exactly that scenario. On this particular Saturday morning, I stood in Eleanor's restored garden, watching Priya teach a group of 8-year-olds about the life cycle of plants. The roses had been properly pruned, the jasmine was blooming again, and new volunteers had helped expand the beds to include vegetables that would supply our community kitchen. She would have loved this, Darla said, joining me on the stone bench where Eleanor and I had shared so many conversations. She held a small glass frame containing a pressed white lily, one of the original flowers from Eleanor's garden, carefully preserved. I keep thinking I should feel guilty, I admitted, about the family, about Mother leaving, about changing everything Eleanor built here. Your grandmother didn't build this house to be a monument to her own comfort, Darla replied gently. She lived here because it was where she could love and be loved. Now it's serving that same purpose for dozens of families. As if summoned by our conversation, Sarah Chen approached with her notebook and camera. Ready for the follow-up interview? She asked. 6 months later, how the Liam Hartwell Community Center is changing lives. I nodded, watching a young mother practice reading with her toddler under the oak tree where Eleanor used to sit. In the distance, teenagers worked in the vegetable garden, learning about nutrition and responsibility. The mansion's grand rooms echoed with laughter and conversation instead of formal silence. A letter had arrived that morning, postmarked from Atlanta with no return address. Inside, my mother's handwriting covered a single sheet. I may never understand your choices, but I'm beginning to understand hers. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. Standing in Eleanor's garden, surrounded by the living legacy she'd entrusted to me, I finally understood what she'd meant about patience and growth. Love, like gardens, couldn't be controlled or forced. It could only be tended with care and given room to flourish in its own way and its own time. 1 year after Eleanor's funeral, I returned to her bedroom for the last time. The room had been converted into a quiet reading space for the community center, but I'd asked Darla to leave it untouched for this final visit. Moonlight filtered through the lace curtains just as it had that night when I'd discovered her journal. But now, the space felt peaceful rather than haunted. I sat at her writing desk, the same mahogany surface where she'd penned the journal entries that changed my life, and began to write my own letter, not to the living, but to the woman whose love had given me the courage to become myself. Dear Grandmother Eleanor, it's been a year since you left us, and I wanted you to know what your garden has grown into. The foundation you dreamed of now serves 200 families. The literacy program has expanded to 3 locations. The scholarship fund you secretly established has sent 12 students to college this year alone. But more than that, you changed me. I used to think love meant keeping everyone happy, even when happiness required lies. You taught me that real love sometimes means disappointing people in service of something larger than their comfort. You showed me that kindness isn't weakness, it's the hardest form of strength. Mother wrote again last month. She's volunteering at a literacy program in Atlanta now. She says she's trying to understand what you saw in helping others. I think, maybe, you're still teaching her too, even from wherever you are. The white lilies are blooming again in your garden. I planted them where you taught me, and this time, no one will throw them away. Children play where we used to sit together, and their laughter sounds like the prayers you used to whisper over your flowers. I know you never needed thanks for loving me, but I'm giving them anyway. Thank you for seeing who I could become when I couldn't see it myself. Thank you for choosing love over control, compassion over reputation, truth over peace. Thank you for teaching me that the most important legacy isn't what we leave behind, but what we plant in others that continues to grow. All my love, Liam. I folded the letter carefully and walked to Eleanor's garden, where the white lilies swayed in the Charleston breeze. I buried it beneath the rosebush we'd planted together when I was 12, returning my words to the earth that had nurtured both of us. As dawn broke over the community center that had once been our family's monument to appearances, I watched children arrive for Saturday morning garden club. Their eager faces reminded me of myself at their age, hungry for attention, for guidance, for someone to see their potential and nurture it with patience. "Mr. Liam," called 7-year-old Marcus, tugging on my sleeve, "can you teach us about the flowers today? Miss Darla says you know all their secrets." I smiled, feeling Eleanor's presence in the morning light, in the bloom of her lilies, in the trust of a child who believed I had something worth teaching. "Of course," I said, kneeling to his level among the flowers. "But first, let me tell you about a woman who taught me that love is the only seed that never stops growing." Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.